put what you've learned in practice, build a library, share it with the whole world on NuGet. This series is going to show you how. Hello and welcome to Code with Sar. I'm Sar. How are you doing? Today's topic is about building a library. I like to build library when I find myself writing the same code again and again. JWT Authentication authorization code falls into that category. I think there are a lot of benefits building a library. Like I can reuse my code in various projects, and it will give me a code base to consistently improving on. I want to show you how I built a library in the hope of encourage you to start building libraries by yourself, to give me some feedback and benefit the community. There are a lot of topics, and I'm going to make it a series. In this series, I hope you can get more understanding around JWT authentication authorization. At the same time, we're going to take a look at the technologies around building a library that we usually won't consider. Topics like multi-targeting, which makes a library to work under multiple versions of .NET Framework, and how to build and release a NuGet package, how to leverage extension methods, how to apply IOptions pattern, so on and so forth. In this first video, though, I will be focused on the consumer's perspective, primarily introducing the functionalities that is built in the library and how to use them. It will be shallow but wide. I hope this will give you a whole picture. And then in the follow-up videos, we will, in each one, pick a specific topic, stick to it, and go deep. Without further ado, let's get started. Let me show you my environment. I have two versions of SDK installed, 3.1 and 5.0, and 5.0 is going to be the primary one. Now let's create the demo project. We're going to give it the name of JWTAuth lib. To make the demo simple, I'm going to specify no OpenAPI here. Let me open it in VS Code. As you can see, it is an empty WebAPI project. I'll commit it, and that's our test user application. As a consumer, the first thing to do is to add a reference to the NuGet package. To reference the latest one, I would go to NuGet.org and type in the package name. Once we find the package, here's this shorthands to copy the command line that need to be used. Back to VS Code, paste in the command line in the terminal, and we'll see the package got added. I would usually go to the CS proj file to examine the package name and the version, and then I'll commit the change. As you can see, from the user's perspective, a NuGet package is very easy to consume. Once the package is referenced, there are usually two spots to configure the functionality. The first one is this ConfigureServices, which is responsible for adding services into a service container. We could add loose services here. We would also expect the library to provide some extension method and add the services related to the package directly. For example, since our package is about JWT, it is providing this add.JWTAuth method. This is an extension method. In the future, I'll show you how to build them into your library. It is also a common pattern for this method to take in an action of an option, so that as the consumer, they will be able to put in values onto the options. For example, here, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to set the OnValidateUserInfo delegate. During the authentication, this is a callback when the user requests a token. It is used to verify the user's information and decide whether that is a valid user or not. This is something the library cannot know ahead of time. So the user will need to decide here whether to return a valid user as user info or to return none if the user is not valid. I plan to talk more about that when we touch the design of library in depth. For now, I'll just assume every user is a valid user and I'm going to return a hard-coded user info. In the real world, you probably need to fetch the user by username from database, check the password, or actually the hash value of the password before return the user info. That process is usually asynchronous nowadays, and it is something a library author need to consider. and that's ConfigureServices. The other method to pay attention to is this configure method. This is where a request pipeline is set up. If you heard about middleware in the context of ASP.NET Core, this is the pipeline they are talking about. In the library of JWT I actually created the middleware, and it is set up by this UseJWTAuth method. And I will show you how to do that as well in the future. Okay, the setup is done. You are ready to use the JWT Authentication in your WebAPI. Let's just move on and protect the WeatherForecast controller with Authorization. It is as simple as add this authorize attribute onto the controller, so that no one can access this controller unless they are authorized. If you don't know what I'm talking about here, please check out the first two videos where I talk about JWT Authentication. Let's see it in action. First, let's hit this WeatherForecast without any authentication, and we'll get the response of 401 unauthorized. By the way, there are two status codes that you should know. 401 means you're not authorized. That means the API doesn't know who you are. In other words, there's no identity associated with the request. The other common error is 403. That is unauthorized. And that error basically means I know who you are, but you don't have the permission to perform the action that you requested. Understand the difference in these error code will help you debugging when authentication authorization fails. They will tell you which phase it failed. Is that authentication or authorization? Let's go ahead and get an access token. The token is your identity, and this getting token process is actually authentication. Let's use this access token, aka JWT token, to access the weather forecast. It worked, but then there are some questions. For example, where did this /token endpoint come from? We have a controller for weather forecast. We don't have a controller for token, right? And did you notice, even though the weather forecast is protected by authentication, the /token wasn't. Does that mean everybody can come in and fetch a token to access the weather forecast? Then what's the point for the authentication? Third one, if you know the JWT authentication, you know the token is protected by a signature, which requires a private key. Who's specifying the private key at this moment? I would also want to know how to implement row authentication. In the next section, I'll answer these questions one by another. Let's start with the simple one. Who's handling the request to /token? Of course, it's the authentication library, right? But as a consumer of this library, should I be allowed to specify my endpoint other than /token? Yes, of course. And this is how. Instead of /token, I want the token root to be /access token. And the other side of the coin, as a library author, we will need to make an effort to allow this scenario. So note it down, and we're going to talk more about that. Now let's see the change. Firstly, if we still go ahead and hitting the /token endpoint, it will become 404, not found. And then if we try to hit /access token, we're going to get it back. Let's talk about signing secret. If you pay attention to the host log, there is a warning. The issuer signing secret is not specified, using random string as the secret's temporary. So you have the answer now. It is not that it doesn't exist. It's just that we as user didn't set it specifically, and the temporary string is generated and used. It is okay to use a random string for testing. There are several issues. Firstly, a token that is generated before a restart and after a restart will have different private key for signature. So the token will become invalid once the app restarts, and that will then require the end user to sign in more frequent than needed. Another problem is about scaling. When you have multiple instances of the application, the access token cannot be used across them. That, to some degree, beats the purpose of the scaling. So obviously, as a library, we will need to allow the user to specify the secret by themselves. The user could do it in the way they specify token path. Just like what you see on the screen, there are some baked-in problems. First, it is hard-coded. And we all know C# compiles to IL and can easily be decompiled. From that perspective, I don't care whether it's deployed to the server or not. It's just a bad idea to bake in any secret into your source code. And then, since it's a compiled code, you cannot switch it easily once the code is deployed. And you cannot set up different values for different environments, like one for development, one for production, so on and so forth. To overcome those defects, I implemented actually all those configurations options pattern. Let me show you what it brings us. And in the future, I plan to have options as a separate topic, and we can look into those implementations in depth. For now, to consume it, the user should pay attention to this JWT options class. It comes with the section name that you can use in the appsettings.json. Or if it is for development environment, it's appsettings.development.json. Under the section, we can specify values for the properties. For example, the property that we are interested in at this moment is the issuer sign-in secret. Once that's set, and if we restart the app, you will notice the warning is gone. As a matter of fact, we could do the same for token path. Why is this better? To start with, the value got loaded upon restart. If you need a new value, well, update the settings, restart your app, and you're done. On the other hand, you can keep using the same value in between restarts of your apps. Second, you can specify different values for different environments, like this one for development, that one in appsettings.json for production. You get the idea. Third, probably the most important one, those app settings file is not the only providers for these values. It could really be some place that is more secure, like Azure Key Vault. If you set everything up correct, it could end up being an infrastructure that only your application have access to the private key. And when I say your application, I mean your application. It doesn't include you or anyone else on this world. If that generates enough interesting, I probably could throw another video talking about that. Coming back, let me put a new value of auth for the access token path, so that we can see that it's actually the value in the appsettings.development.json that is loaded. Now /access token root is gone, 44 not found is returned, and the new endpoint of /auth is in effect. Okay, let's see the third question. Is the token endpoint protected? From the demos we saw so far, it looks like it is not protected. Well, actually it is. Let me set a breakpoint here to see what's happening. When the token endpoint is hit, this delegate that we configured before is actually called. Several interesting spots. The JSON body is empty because we didn't put in any body in the request. The UserInfo instance is always returned, and the user will always have a name of SAR. Remember the authentication authorization? This is the authentication, and the authentication result is always going to be successful with the name of SAR. In other words, whatever your credential is, I always treat you as a valid user whose name is SAR. So this is an abuse of the authentication. What is the user supposed to do in the normal case? Well, firstly, in the call, they should have a body which includes the proper credential. The credential could be a username, password combination, or it could be a shared key, it could be anything that the server accepts. If it is a username and password, the request will look like this. And when it's invoked, the server will get the credential in this JSON body. What the server usually will do, it will deserialize this JSON to a strong typed object. And by the way, deserialization in this context is to form up a C# object from a string. Once the app got the login credential, it will then go ahead and compare it with the record, maybe in database or some other places. Here, I'm just going to put down a to-do item here An example of interaction with database is actually talked about in another video, and I'm going to put a link here. Let's assume the validation passes. I'm going to create the user info from the login information. If you want, you can try to return a null. In this case, the authentication will fail that way. Let's run it again. This time, we can see the username and password in form of a C# object rather than a loose string, thanks to the deserializer. And we update the code to return an identity with the username from the login. The username specified is the string hello. Let's see if that is what showed up in the token. Alright, finally, is role authentication supported? Of course. What we are missing here is when we do the authentication, role information wasn't in the picture. To add role information, we need to set up this OnValidateUserInfo delegate. This one takes in a valid user and then expect it to return an enumerable of string. Each element represents a role. In the real world example, when you get the user, you probably go ahead and query the database or some other places to determine what roles the user is in and return it here. For the sake of simplicity, I will use the username as a role to be returned. For example, if the user named hello, the role is going to be hello as well. If the user is named star, the role is star. The user named literal user, the role is going to be user. With that in place, now I can protect the resource with a specific role. Let's say this API only allows any user that has a role of user. And of course, in our case, it would be the user have to be named user, does have a role of user, and then it will be able to use this API. Let's see the change in action. Let's first get an access token for user hello and see how the token looks like. At this point, the authentication is done. We can check the access token. There's a username of hello and also role of hello. That's the identity. And if we use this identity to hit the WeatherForecast endpoint, we're going to get a 4-3 back, which is forbidden. Again, the server is saying, hey, I know you. Your identity is true and legitimate, but you just don't have permission to access this resource. So who has the permission? Whomever have a role of user. In our case, a user named user. And let's try that. That's a lot we touched today. Like I said at the beginning of the video, this one is about the whole picture. I was trying to make the point as clear as possible. It will be still appreciated if you ask for clarifications. If you are interested in any of the topic that I mentioned, subscribe and you'll get a notification when the video talking about that specific topic is available. I hope you all enjoyed it. Press the like button to let me know. Keep coding, keep improving. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, take care.